When I stepped into that hospital ward, my throat tightened so severely I thought I might collapse right there. Maverick, my Maverick, lay motionless on the sterile white bed, thick bandages wrapped around his head like a crown of suffering. His piercing blue eyes, which once gazed at me with such overwhelming devotion, now scanned me with complete detachment, as if I were some random visitor who'd wandered into the wrong room. The doctors had prepared me during that agonizing phone call, explaining how the car accident had stolen significant portions of his memory, but hearing those clinical words was entirely different from witnessing the devastating reality firsthand. My legs trembled as I approached his bedside, fingers clutching the cold metal railing for support, and I forced myself to speak through the tightness in my chest. "Maverick, do you recognize me? It's Dylan. You're Dylan." His gaze traveled slowly from my face down to my shoes and back up again, analytical and distant, before a small laugh escaped his lips. That same warm chuckle that used to make my heart flutter, now twisted into something that felt like mockery. "Dylan," he repeated, one eyebrow arching upward in apparent confusion. "I'm sorry, but I genuinely have no idea who you are." Those words shattered something fundamental inside me, like a vase dropped from a great height, breaking into irreparable pieces. My hands instinctively moved to touch my wedding band, the smooth gold ring that encircled my finger, still gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, as if desperately trying to prove that our love, our marriage, our entire shared existence had been real and not some elaborate fantasy I'd constructed. Maverick's attention followed my movement, and he stared at the ring with intense focus, his expression shifting to something resembling disgust mixed with bewilderment. "Hold on," he said slowly, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "Are you actually married to someone?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words seemed to die somewhere between my brain and my tongue. Tears burned behind my eyes, threatening to spill over, but I fought desperately to maintain some semblance of composure, because I couldn't bear the thought of Maverick seeing me as weak or pathetic, even though he clearly didn't see me as anything at all anymore. "Yes," I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. "I'm married." Maverick's lips curved into that infuriating smile again, as though I'd just told him the world's most amusing joke. "Seriously? You?" He shook his head slowly, and I could see the disbelief written plainly across his features. "Wow. Who's the unfortunate person who ended up tied to you?" The floor seemed to vanish beneath my feet, leaving me suspended in a void of pure anguish. "Unfortunate?" He was describing himself, talking about our sacred union as if it were some cosmic punishment, completely unaware that he was the one who had pursued me relentlessly, who had declared under countless starlit skies that my scent drove him absolutely insane with desire, who had held me throughout endless nights as though releasing me might cause his world to stop spinning. And now here he stood, or rather lay before me, transformed into a cold stranger wearing my husband's beautiful face, casually mocking the most precious bond we'd ever forged. "Maverick," I choked out, my voice fracturing under the weight of my emotions. "That unfortunate person is you. We're married to each other." His laughter ceased abruptly, replaced by expression of pure shock that rapidly morphed into stubborn disbelief. "What did you just say?" He pulled back slightly against his pillows, as if I'd just confessed to something absolutely impossible. "No. That can't be right. I would never marry an Omega, especially not someone who's so what?" I interrupted, my tone now carrying both hurt and rising anger. "What exactly are you trying to say about me, Maverick?" He wouldn't meet my gaze anymore, instead fixing his attention on some indeterminate spot on the pale wall, as though hoping he could somehow escape this entire uncomfortable conversation through sheer force of will. "I don't know how to explain it, all right? This whole situation feels fundamentally wrong. Nothing about it makes any sense to me." Later that evening, when I finally dragged myself out of that suffocating hospital room and into the cool night air, my wedding ring remained firmly on my finger, but its weight had somehow multiplied exponentially, as though it had transformed from precious gold into solid lead, because now this ring represented nothing more than a memory, a beautiful treasured memory that existed solely within my mind, completely erased from Maverick's consciousness as if our years together had never occurred at all. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, unable to turn the key, unable to drive away, unable to accept that the man I loved more than my own existence couldn't even remember my name. The parking lot lights cast long shadows across the dashboard, and I watched them shift and change as other visitors came and went, living their normal lives while mine had just been torn apart. My phone buzzed multiple times with concerned messages from friends and family, but I couldn't bring myself to read them, let alone respond with explanations I didn't have the strength to articulate. Eventually, I forced myself to drive home to our apartment, the space we'd carefully decorated together, filled with inside jokes and shared dreams. But as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar surroundings felt alien and hollow. The framed photographs on the walls showed two happy people I no longer recognized. The couch still bore the indent where Maverick always sat, pulled close to my side. His coffee mug sat in the sink, abandoned mid-morning on the day of his accident, still bearing faint traces of his favorite blend. I collapsed onto our bed, my bed now, I supposed, and finally allowed myself to completely fall apart. The sobs came in violent waves, shaking my entire body as I clutched his pillow, desperately inhaling any remaining traces of his scent. The vanilla and sandalwood combination that had always calmed my anxiety now only intensified my grief. How was I supposed to continue existing in a world where Maverick looked at me like I was nobody? How could I possibly wake up each morning knowing that the most important person in my life had forgotten every kiss, every promise, every whispered declaration of eternal love? The ring on my finger caught the moonlight streaming through our bedroom window, creating small rainbow refractions on the ceiling, the same ceiling we'd stared at together countless times while planning our future, discussing everything from potential baby names to retirement dreams. Those conversations felt like they'd happened in another lifetime now, to different people who no longer existed. I twisted the ring slowly around my finger, considering removing it for the first time since our wedding day 3 years ago. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew I couldn't do it, because removing this ring would mean accepting that everything we'd built together was truly finished. And despite the absolute devastation currently tearing through my soul, I wasn't ready to give up on us. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Maverick's discharge from the hospital took exactly 7 days, and during that entire agonizing week, I attempted to mentally prepare myself for what bringing him home would actually mean. The medical team had strongly suggested that familiar surroundings might trigger memory restoration, explaining how environmental cues often served as powerful catalysts for patients with traumatic amnesia. So our apartment, the cozy 2-bedroom space that had once represented our sanctuary from the outside world, was now being repositioned as some kind of experimental treatment facility. I'd anticipated difficulty, certainly, but nothing could have adequately prepared me for the soul-crushing reality of watching my husband examine our shared home with the detached curiosity of a real estate agent evaluating a property. During the drive from the hospital, Maverick sat rigidly in the passenger seat, staring out the window at passing scenery as though everything was completely foreign to him. He didn't comment on the route I took, didn't notice when I deliberately drove past the coffee shop where we'd had our first official date, didn't react when we pulled into the parking garage he'd navigated thousands of times before. His silence felt louder than any words could have been, a constant reminder that the man sitting beside me was simultaneously everything and nothing like the person I'd married. When we finally arrived and I unlocked our front door, Maverick hesitated on the threshold, visibly uncertain about entering. After a long pause, he stepped inside cautiously, his movements calculated and wary, like someone exploring potentially dangerous territory. His eyes swept across every visible surface, the gallery wall displaying our photographs from various trips and celebrations, the oversized sectional sofa where we'd spent countless Friday evenings binge-watching series while tangled together, the kitchen where I'd attempted to surprise him with homemade birthday cakes that always turned out slightly lopsided, but which he'd devoured enthusiastically anyway. Yet his expression remained frustratingly blank, devoid of recognition or warmth or any indication that these surroundings held meaning. "This is our home," I announced, trying desperately to inject some optimism into my voice despite the growing knot of dread in my stomach. "Maybe being here will help certain memories surface naturally." Maverick responded with only a curt nod before walking directly toward the guest bedroom, that rarely used space we'd always jokingly called the room for hypothetical visitors, who never actually materialized. because we preferred having our privacy. Now he was claiming it as his own territory, physically separating himself from me, choosing to sleep alone rather than sharing the bed where we'd spent every night wrapped around each other. The symbolic rejection cut deeper than I wanted to admit. The following morning, after a sleepless night spent staring at my ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar silence, I ventured into the kitchen and discovered Maverick already awake, standing before the coffee maker with an expression of mild concentration. For one brief, glorious moment, my heart lifted with hope. This was such a familiar scene. Perhaps some muscle memory was activating. Maybe his subconscious recognized the routine. But when I moved closer, he glanced at me with that same polite but impersonal look he might give any housemate. "Would you like some coffee as well?" he asked, his tone perfectly cordial yet completely devoid of intimacy. "Yes, thank you," I replied, forcing my face into what I hoped resembled a genuine smile even though it felt grotesquely fake. We consumed our coffee in uncomfortable silence, the only sounds coming from occasional sips and the distant traffic outside our windows. Then unexpectedly, Maverick broke the quiet. "So, how exactly did we meet?" Originally, something inside my chest flickered to life. Genuine curiosity, an actual question about our shared past. The first real opening he'd given me since the accident. "We met during college." I began carefully, selecting each word with precision. "You were in the library researching for a literature paper, and I accidentally grabbed the same reference book you needed. You seemed pretty annoyed initially, but then something changed. You noticed my scent, and your entire demeanor shifted. After that day, you started showing up wherever I happened to be on campus." Maverick set down his mug with deliberate slowness, his face impossible to read. "Your scent," he repeated, as though testing how the concept felt in his mouth. Then, without warning, he leaned slightly toward me, inhaling near my neck in an apparent attempt to understand what I meant. My entire body went completely rigid, frozen between hope and terror. This was the closest physical proximity we'd experienced since before the accident, and I could feel his warm breath against my skin, could smell his own distinctive scent mixing with mine, could almost convince myself that any second now he'd remember everything and pull me into his arms. Instead, he withdrew and stated flatly, "I'm not experiencing any particular reaction." Those 6 words carved a hollow space directly through my chest. No reaction. He felt absolutely nothing, not even a flicker of the intense attraction he'd once described as completely intoxicating. The connection he'd sworn was unlike anything he'd experienced with anyone else. I quickly dropped my gaze to my coffee, blinking rapidly to prevent tears from forming where he might see them. "I understand," I whispered. Throughout the remainder of that day, Maverick wandered through our apartment, conducting what felt like a forensic investigation of our life together. He examined our wedding album, which sat prominently displayed on the coffee table, turning each page slowly and studying every photograph with academic detachment. I observed from the doorway, barely breathing, silently begging the universe to let anything, spark recognition. But after several minutes he simply closed the album and delivered his verdict in a flat, emotionless tone. "These pictures look completely fabricated to me, like they're documenting someone else's relationship entirely." That night, lying alone in our king-sized bed that suddenly felt enormous and empty, I stared at my wedding ring as it caught and reflected the moonlight filtering through our curtains. The band still shone brilliantly, still symbolized promises that apparently only I remembered making and receiving. And it occurred to me with devastating clarity that perhaps Maverick was right. Perhaps everything I bemmed so vividly was actually some kind of elaborate illusion. Because the man who had loved me with such fierce intensity that he'd literally cried during his wedding vows, who had whispered my name in his sleep, who had claimed I was his perfect match in every possible way, that man had ceased to exist. In his place was this hollow stranger who happened to share Maverick's face and voice, but possessed none of his warmth or affection or recognition of what we'd meant to each other. I twisted the ring around my finger contemplatively, once again considering whether removing it might somehow make this nightmare easier to endure. But even as I entertained the thought, I knew it was impossible. This ring represented the last tangible proof that our love had been real, that I hadn't imagined or exaggerated the depth of our connection. And until I had absolutely no choice, I would continue wearing it, continue hoping, continue believing that somewhere deep inside Maverick's damaged mind, some trace of us still survived. The days gradually accumulated into weeks, and rather than improving or softening, Maverick's behavior deteriorated into something increasingly hostile. Initially, he had simply maintained emotional distance, creating invisible barriers through his coldness and disinterest. But as time progressed, his attitude shifted from passive indifference to active cruelty, as though he decided that merely ignoring me wasn't sufficient. He needed to actively push me away. One morning I prepared breakfast with particular care, making blueberry pancakes from scratch because they'd always been his absolute favorite weekend meal. I arranged them artfully on his plate, added fresh berries and a drizzle of maple syrup in the pattern he'd always appreciated, and set everything before him with cautious optimism. He glanced down at the plate without enthusiasm and announced in a bored, dismissive tone, "I don't want this." Just those 5 simple, devastating words. No explanation, no acknowledgement of the effort. Nothing. I silently removed the plate and retreated to the kitchen, turning on the faucet full blast so the running water would mask the sound of my quiet crying. Following that incident, smaller but equally painful criticisms became routine occurrences, each one carefully designed, whether consciously or not, to make me feel inadequate and unwanted. Whenever I took my heat suppressants, which all omegas required to function normally in society, Maverick would make pointed observations. "Why do you constantly need those pills? Most omegas manage just fine without such heavy medication." He'd say it casually, as though making an innocent observation, rather than implying that something was fundamentally wrong with my biology, that my existence was somehow more burdensome and problematic than it should be. One evening, after gathering every ounce of courage I possessed, I attempted to create a romantic atmosphere for dinner. I set our dining table properly, lit candles throughout the room, selected soft instrumental music to play in the background, and prepared his favorite pasta dish with meticulous attention to detail. I'd convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, recreating the kind of intimate setting we used to cherish might trigger some emotional response, might remind him on some subconscious level of what we'd once shared. But when Maverick entered the dining room and surveyed my preparations, his face twisted with uncomfortable confusion. "What's all this supposed to be? Are you seriously trying to seduce me or something? Because this feels really forced and awkward. I just wanted us to spend some actual quality time together," I explained, fighting to keep the desperation out of my voice even as I felt it rising in my throat. Maverick dropped his fork onto his plate with an unnecessarily loud clatter, the sound echoing through our suddenly too quiet apartment. "Listen, Dylan. I have absolutely no idea what kind of relationship we supposedly had before, but I'm clearly not that person anymore. So this whole performance you're putting on needs to stop immediately. You're making me extremely uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. Our history together, our intimacy, my very presence, all of it made him uncomfortable now. I simply nodded mutely, unable to trust my voice, knowing that if I attempted to speak I would completely shatter right there at the dinner table we'd purchased together, where we'd shared countless meals and conversations and plans for our future. Then came the afternoon that truly broke something fundamental inside me. I was sitting in our living room, absently rotating my wedding ring around my finger while lost in memories, when Maverick suddenly appeared and spoke with obvious irritation. "You're still wearing that thing constantly? Why? I don't remember you, don't remember us, don't remember anything, yet you're clinging to that piece of metal like it's some kind of sacred object." "Because it is sacred," I responded, and despite the turmoil inside me, my voice emerged steady and firm. "This ring represents our commitment to each other, Maverick. Just because you don't remember doesn't mean it never happened. I remember everything, every single moment we shared." He released a harsh, mocking laugh that physically hurt worse than if he'd actually struck me. "Commitment? Are you serious right now, Dylan? If this supposed commitment was so incredibly important and meaningful, then why would I completely forget about it? Maybe it was never as significant as you've built it up to be in your head. Maybe this was just your obsession and I went along with it because I felt sorry for you or something." My hands clenched into tight fists at my sides, nails digging into my palms hard enough to leave marks. This had gone too far, crossed too many lines. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, and now my voice clearly conveyed my desperation and confusion. "Why are you deliberately trying to hurt me when you know perfectly well how much?" "Because I'm frustrated beyond belief. Maverick suddenly shouted, and this represented the first time he'd actually raised his voice since returning from the hospital. His eyes were wide and fierce, blazing with anger I didn't understand. I can't comprehend why I supposedly married you. Look at yourself, Dylan. You're completely ordinary. Nothing special or remarkable at all. So explain it to me, what was it? Was I going through some crisis? Did you manipulate me emotionally when I was vulnerable? Each accusation landed like a physical blow, systematically destroying whatever fragile hope I'd been clinging to. Ordinary. Unremarkable. Manipulative. Every word was carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage, and they succeeded spectacularly. My vision blurred with tears that now flowed freely, no longer controllable. I never forced you into anything. I managed to say through my shaking voice. You loved me genuinely. You actually loved me. You were the one who proposed, got down on one knee in front of everyone, crying happy tears. Then I obviously made the most catastrophic mistake of my entire life. He replied with cold finality before turning and walking away, leaving me standing there completely demolished. That night marked the first time I seriously contemplated removing my wedding ring permanently. Perhaps the moment had finally arrived to accept that the Maverick who had loved me, really truly loved me, was gone forever, as dead as if the accident had actually killed him. I reached for the ring multiple times, fingers touching the warm metal, preparing to slide it off. But each time I tried, my hand refused to cooperate, because removing this ring would mean severing the last remaining connection between us, admitting that everything we'd built together was definitively over. And despite everything he'd said, despite all the cruelty and rejection and pain, I discovered I still wasn't ready to let go. Not yet, maybe not ever. Because as long as I wore this ring, some part of me could still believe that our love had been real, that it had mattered, that somewhere buried beneath all this damage and confusion, the man I married might still exist. An entire month had elapsed since the accident, and not a single fragment of Maverick's memory had returned. Each day had transformed into an exhausting battle for survival, leaving me depleted on every conceivable level, physically weakened, emotionally hollowed out, mentally paralyzed by constant anxiety. At work I'd stare blankly at my computer screen for hours, unable to process even the simplest tasks, my colleagues casting concerned glances that I pretended not to notice. Food had lost all appeal. Meals became mechanical obligations rather than sources of nourishment or pleasure. But the most alarming development was the dramatic alteration in my scent. What had once been a warm, inviting vanilla fragrance, the aroma that Maverick had claimed made him dizzy with desire, had gradually soured into something bitter and faded, like flowers left too long without water. I understood the biological reality. An omega's scent directly reflected their emotional and physical well-being, and mine was broadcasting a clear message to anyone perceptive enough to notice. I was disintegrating from the inside out. One evening I returned from grocery shopping, arms laden with bags, muscles aching from exhaustion that went far deeper than physical fatigue. As I approached our apartment door, I heard Maverick's voice drifting from the living room, engaged in what sounded like an animated phone conversation. He either hadn't heard me enter or was deliberately choosing to ignore my presence. I moved quietly toward the kitchen to set down my purchases, intending to give him privacy. But as I passed through the hallway, fragments of his conversation reached my ears, and what I heard made me freeze completely, barely breathing. Listen, I understand this whole situation is bizarre, Maverick was saying to whoever was on the other end, his tone casual and conversational. This guy keeps insisting we're married, but honestly I feel absolutely nothing for him. Zero connection. And he's an omega, which you know has never been my preference. I've always been attracted to strong, independent types who have their own lives, not someone who's this suffocating. Suffocating, that single word pierced through me like a blade. I bent over backwards trying to give him space, adjusting every aspect of my behavior to accommodate his comfort, walking on eggshells constantly, and yet somehow I was still suffocating him simply by existing. My grip on the grocery bags tightened until my knuckles blanched white, the plastic handles cutting into my palms. I stood there motionless behind the wall, continuing to listen even though each word caused physical pain, because somewhere along the way I'd apparently developed masochistic tendencies. If nothing changes in the next couple weeks, I'm genuinely planning to move forward with my life, Maverick continued, and his words felt like daggers, systematically puncturing my chest. There's no logical reason to maintain this pretend relationship when I have zero emotional investment. It's not beneficial for either of us to continue this charade. Pretend. Our marriage was pretend in his perception. Our love, our vows, every promise we'd exchanged, all categorized as an elaborate charade. I squeezed my eyes shut and attempted a deep, steadying breath, trying desperately to contain the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm me completely. But then something primal awakened inside me. Those deep omega instincts that recognized on a visceral level that my alpha, my supposed mate, was actively rejecting our bond, and suddenly my chest constricted painfully, making each breath a struggle. A full-blown panic attack was descending rapidly, and I had no defense against it. I somehow managed to stumble to the bathroom, locking the door behind me before collapsing onto the cold tile floor. My hands clutched at my heaving chest as tears streamed uncontrollably down my face. The logical part of my brain acknowledged that Maverick wasn't entirely wrong in his assessment. If he genuinely remembered nothing, what justification did I have for artificially maintaining this relationship? Why was I subjecting both of us to this daily torture, clinging desperately to something that no longer existed? But then my blurred vision landed on my wedding ring, still gleaming softly under the bathroom's harsh fluorescent lighting, despite my tears. And suddenly I was transported back to that perfect moment when Maverick had slid this ring onto my finger, his own face wet with happy tears, as he'd whispered, "Dylan, you are my entire world. I cannot breathe without you. Promise me you'll never abandon me, no matter what happens." He had said those words. Those emotions had been genuine and real. Even if Maverick's damaged brain couldn't access those memories anymore, they still existed within me, vivid and undeniable. Perhaps these memories were precisely what kept me tethered to this dying relationship, even as it caused unbearable suffering. When I finally composed myself enough to emerge from the bathroom, Maverick was standing in the hallway, arms folded across his chest, regarding me with an expression that mingled judgment with irritation. "Are you all right?" he asked. But the question carried no genuine concern, merely obligatory politeness. "Absolutely perfect," I responded with heavy sarcasm, though internally I was anything but. "Good," he replied curtly before immediately retreating to his room, closing the door with slightly more force than necessary. That night represented a turning point in my thinking. For the first time, I genuinely considered that perhaps I needed to legally terminate this marriage. Maybe filing divorce papers was the only sensible path forward at this juncture, because if I remained trapped in this toxic cycle indefinitely, I would eventually destroy myself completely, leaving nothing recognizable behind. Yet when I reached out to touch my ring once more, a realization crystallized. I needed to grant us one final opportunity. Myself, Maverick, and the memories we'd created together. One last desperate attempt to remind him of who we'd been, what we'd meant to each other. And if that ultimate effort failed, then I would finally walk away. Because my remaining strength was nearly depleted and I couldn't sustain this much longer. I lay awake most of that night, staring at the ceiling and formulating a plan. There was one place that held profound significance for us, a location where we'd shared some of our most intimate moments. If anywhere could trigger his memory, it would be there. Tomorrow I would take him to that special place, and I would lay everything bare, all my feelings, all our history, everything. And then whatever happened next would determine our fate. I touched my ring one more time before finally drifting into fitful sleep, holding on to hope by the thinnest possible thread. Because sometimes hope was all we had left, even when logic suggested it was foolish to maintain it. And I wasn't quite ready to relinquish that hope. Not yet. Perhaps I never would be, because letting go of hope meant letting go of Maverick entirely, and that prospect terrified me more than continuing to endure this pain. When dawn broke the following morning, I awakened with absolute clarity regarding what needed to happen next. I would take Maverick to one very specific location, our place where we'd first confessed our love for each other beneath a canopy of stars, where we'd shared our first kiss as an official couple, both of us trembling with nervous excitement and overwhelming emotion. Perhaps, just perhaps, that meaningful location might serve as the catalyst his damaged mind required. This represented my absolute final attempt, and if it proved unsuccessful, I would quietly accept that the Maverick who'd loved me had vanished permanently. At breakfast I approached him as casually as I could manage, though my heart was pounding anxiously. Do you have any obligations today? If not, maybe we could get some fresh air together. Just a short drive. He regarded me with obvious suspicion, clearly uncomfortable with the prospect of spending extended time in my company, but eventually he shrugged with apparent indifference. I suppose that's acceptable. We took my car and I drove in deliberate silence toward the small park situated on the city's outskirts. This location held tremendous significance, tranquil, peaceful, embraced by nature, where we'd frequently escape during our college years whenever the world felt overwhelmingly chaotic. When we arrived and I parked, Maverick peered through the window with confusion evident on his features. Why have you brought me to this isolated spot? Because it's not isolated to us, I explained gently, carefully exiting the vehicle. This is our place. We created important memories here together. Maverick's expression conveyed clear doubt, but he followed me nonetheless as I led him along the familiar pathway. We approached the weathered wooden bench positioned beneath an enormous oak tree, its sprawling branches providing generous shade. I placed my hand on the bench's smooth surface, and immediately memories flooded through me with overwhelming intensity. That perfect afternoon, when Maverick had nervously grasped my hand and declared, "Dylan, I don't care what society dictates about alphas and omegas being together. I love you desperately, only you, and I want to spend my entire existence by your side. Please, sit down," I requested softly, and Maverick hesitantly lowered himself onto the bench. I sat beside him, deliberately maintaining some physical distance because I couldn't bear making him uncomfortable. "Maverick, I realize you remember nothing about us, but I need you to listen completely to what I'm about to share." He turned toward me, his expression neutral yet attentive. "I'm listening." I inhaled deeply, trying to steady my trembling voice. "We first met properly in the college library. Initially you had zero interest in me romantically. You were the campus's most popular alpha, confident, attractive, universally admired. And I was simply an unremarkable omega, nothing that would typically capture your attention." I produced a bitter smile. "But then one day, seemingly out of nowhere, you followed my scent, vanilla and lavender, which you later told me simultaneously calmed and intoxicated you. You approached me nervously and asked if I'd be interested in sharing coffee with you. I was so shocked that I agreed without thinking." Maverick remained silent, simply absorbing my words without interruption. I continued, emotion now seeping into my voice, despite my efforts to remain composed. "We gradually grew closer, becoming best friends initially, and eventually falling deeply, irrevocably in love. You constantly told me that my scent literally addicted you, that seeing me made every problem fade into insignificance. And one day, right here on this exact bench, you proposed marriage. Your hands were shaking violently, and you said, 'Dylan, please marry me. I genuinely cannot envision any future that doesn't include you.' And I said yes through my tears." My voice was shaking severely now, control slipping away despite my best efforts. "You always made me feel valued and cherished, Maverick. When the entire world labeled me average or insignificant, you insisted I was extraordinary. When I doubted my own worth, you would hold me tightly and whisper, 'You belong to me, Dylan, forever mine, and I will never release you.'" Maverick's expression remained frustratingly unchanged, and I felt certain this entire effort was futile. But then, unexpectedly, he spoke slowly. "Everything you're describing sounds incredibly intense and overwhelming, because it was exactly that intense," I replied desperately, tears now flowing freely down my cheeks. "We were passionately devoted to each other, Maverick, completely consumed by our connection. And I understand you remember nothing, but I remember absolutely everything with perfect clarity. Every gentle touch, every passionate kiss, every whispered promise we exchanged. And this ring," I raised my trembling hand to display it clearly, "isn't simply decorative metal. It represents our sacred promise, your promise that you'd remain by my side unconditionally, always." Maverick stared at my ring for several long seconds of complete silence. Then, without warning, he reached into his jacket pocket and slowly withdrew something. His own wedding ring. My heart literally stopped beating momentarily. Why had he been carrying this? What did it signify? "When I first regained consciousness in the hospital, a nurse gave this to me," Maverick explained quietly, studying the ring intently. She mentioned you'd kept it safe during my treatment. I never wore it because I assumed it belonged to some stranger, represented someone else's commitment. He paused meaningfully. But today, while you've been speaking, I've experienced something unusual. I cannot articulate exactly what, but there's definitely something present. Faint and elusive, but undeniably there. My tears were flowing uncontrollably now, hope and desperation mingling together. However, Dylan, he continued with evident seriousness, looking directly into my watery eyes, whatever I'm feeling isn't sufficient. I cannot reciprocate your emotions the way you deserve, the way you clearly expect. And this entire situation remains profoundly unfair to you. You deserve someone capable of loving you completely, not someone who's essentially an empty shell. I recognized he was probably right from a realistic perspective. This situation was monumentally unfair, endless suffering for me, constant pressure for him, toxicity for both. Yet I still couldn't surrender completely. Maverick, I'm not demanding that you suddenly love me again through sheer willpower. I'm simply offering time and space. If your memories eventually return naturally, I'll be here waiting. But if they don't materialize ultimately, then I promise I'll release you completely without any dramatic scenes. Maverick observed me for an extended period, and perhaps for the first time I detected something authentic in his gaze. Possibly guilt, possibly confusion, possibly faint regret. But then he slowly stood and stated in a tired voice, "We should head back now." As we silently returned to the car and began our drive home, I noticed Maverick had carefully returned his ring to his pocket rather than placing it where it belonged on his finger. And I understood with crushing clarity that even this special location, even this emotional confession, had changed absolutely nothing, nothing at all. 2 additional weeks passed quietly, and I had reached complete emotional and physical depletion. Maverick remained exactly as distant and cold as before, and I gradually began accepting that perhaps the doctors had been genuinely mistaken in their optimistic prognosis. Perhaps his memory would realistically never return at all. Suddenly Maverick emerged from his room and noticed me sitting there. "What are you doing up so late?" he asked with casual curiosity. Then his gaze shifted toward my laptop screen. Panicking, I slammed the laptop closed with excessive force. "Nothing important," I stammered unconvincingly. Maverick remained completely silent for several seconds, and I expected he might agree, might say something like, "Yes, you're absolutely right, this is best for both of us." Instead, he suddenly said something entirely unexpected. "Wait, please wait." He nervously reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his wedding ring. The ring he'd been consistently carrying for weeks now. He stared at it intensely before shifting his gaze to meet mine. "I've been experiencing something recently, Dylan. I honestly cannot explain exactly what it is, but when you mentioned divorce just now, I felt deeply uncomfortable, almost panicked, as though I'm about to permanently lose something extremely important and irreplaceable." My heart suddenly began racing wildly. Was this finally a genuine sign of progress? "Maverick, what are you actually trying to tell me?" "I'm saying that perhaps I need additional time," he stated, now looking directly into my desperate, hopeful eyes. "I fully acknowledge that I've caused you severe pain these past weeks, and realistically, I don't deserve your continued patience. But if you could possibly wait just a bit longer, I genuinely promise to make a sincere effort. I will honestly try to remember, to feel something authentic." Hope and doubt waged intense warfare inside me. Could I realistically expose myself to potential heartbreak once again? Could I subject my already shattered psyche to more unbearable pain? But when I looked properly at Maverick, truly looked at him, I saw that rare, genuine desperation in his eyes. And I felt that maybe, just maybe, this finally represented a real turning point. "Maverick," I said, my voice soft yet firm with resolution, "if I agree to wait patiently and your memories still don't return eventually, then I genuinely cannot remain here. I will lose myself completely and permanently. There will be nothing left of who I am." "I completely understand that," he responded with absolute seriousness. "And if that unfortunate outcome occurs, I promise to let you leave peacefully. No unnecessary drama or guilt manipulation. But right now, please grant me one final opportunity." I studied my still gleaming ring carefully as it caught the moonlight streaming through our window, then examined Maverick's ring trembling slightly in his hand. and slowly, very carefully, I extended my hand toward him. If I honestly give you this last chance, you genuinely promise to try sincerely. No half-hearted efforts or empty gestures. Maverick nodded firmly with clear determination. I give you my complete promise. I drew a long, shaky breath, and finally spoke the words. All right then. One more chance. The very last one. And on that quiet evening, beneath the dim illumination of our living room, Maverick used trembling hands to slide his wedding ring back onto his finger for the first time since the accident. The ring clearly felt strange and foreign there, as though it belonged to some unknown person rather than himself. But he made the gesture anyway, and I, once again cautiously, placed a small, fragile piece of hope back inside my broken heart, fully aware that this hope might completely shatter me once more. But genuine love operates precisely this way: foolish, excruciatingly painful, and yet somehow simultaneously heartbreakingly beautiful. And I wasn't emotionally prepared to completely abandon it just yet, even if maintaining hope eventually destroyed me entirely. Because as long as Maverick's ring remained on his finger and my ring stayed firmly on mine, a fragile thread of desperate hope continued to exist between us. And perhaps, just perhaps, that tiny hope would ultimately prove sufficient to sustain us both. Perhaps it would be enough to survive on while we navigated this impossible situation together. Or perhaps I was simply deluding myself, clinging to a fantasy that would never materialize into reality. But either way, I'd made my choice. I would wait just a bit longer, would hold on to hope for just a while more. Because the alternative, accepting that Maverick was truly gone forever, remained too devastating to contemplate. So I would wait, and hope, and pray that somehow, against all logical probability, the man I loved would find his way back to me. Back to us. Back to the love we'd built together and the promises we'd sworn to keep forever.